So if you love the king of rock and roll, Sally Hoedel is a lifelong Elvis enthusiast and the author of a new book, Elvis, Destined to Die Young. I mean, this thing is fantastic, and we have her with her on the program. Sal, I want to jump right into this thing. So why did you decide to write this book?
Absolutely. Well, I'm a lifelong fan, and I'm a journalist and a writer. So it's kind of a coming together for me of, personal and professional endeavor. But as a lifelong fan, I've long noticed that Elvis's story is often sensationalized. The world over, he is still recognizable almost 45 years after his death by his first name and his image alone. And that kind of iconic status, it does lead to, becoming a victim of sensationalism and romanticism, and he almost becomes less than human. So that was a big part of it. I think this story, this aspect, this layer of truth that I've uncovered greatly impacts his legacy. And as a historical figure who culturally shifted the universe, the world over, I think he deserves to be looked at like that and analyzed in that way.
I'm glad that you touched on that, because one thing I recognized reading it, first, you're a journalist. I mean, it's great writing. I want to say it's beautiful. When people think of Elvis, they think of this big icon and kind of, the Beyonce, and they plug in at home and then they get on stage. But what you've done here is you've made him human. I mean, I felt like I can relate to him. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Absolutely. That was my biggest goal. I say all the time that because he is recognizable just by his image and first name, that he's as iconic and recognizable as Mickey Mouse and Coca-Cola. But the difference is that Elvis was a real person, and he struggled a lot. And when we look at his story, just through the narrow lens of sex, drugs, and rock and roll, it's not enough, because his story really is incredible. And it is one of survival and not self-destruction, which is the way it's always been told. He first survives through extreme poverty. His story really does epitomize the American dream. And then he struggles through fame that no one had ever experienced at that level before. And then he struggles through these, health issues, which my book is mainly about. It's not just about his death, but it's how he struggles and lives with all of these ailments and continues being Elvis Presley. So by looking at that, it really does restore his humanity.
I do want to get into some of these misconceptions. So most people think that his lifestyle led to his death. You clear that up in this book. So what actually happened?
Yeah, and Elvis does have a problem with prescription medication, and unfortunately, I think that's kind of how pop culture has remembered him, and they forget to talk as much about his rise as they do his fall. But the truth is that he was an ill man, and by the time he passes in 1977, he has disease and disorder in 9 of the 11 systems of the body. And again, most of that has been written off, throughout the last many decades as the end result of the prescription medication problem. But with my research, evidence shows that at least 5 of those were present prior to fame. Most likely since birth, most likely genetic in nature. His maternal grandparents were first cousins, so we see that play an issue in his mother, who died at 46. Elvis dies at 42. She also has 3 siblings who die very young, and all very similar liver, heart-related issues. So it really stops being a coincidence, and it starts to point to Elvis's young death, and it can explain things for us when we really analyze that, and that's certainly what the book does.
Some people watching this, they might say, how does this lady even know all this? But you actually talked to, I think her name's Tish, right? His traveling nurse, correct?
Yeah, Tish Henley Kirk was his nurse. She did go on tour with him. She also lived at Graceland for many years, so she was on the property. They were good friends, and she was his nurse. So she was a huge resource for me, without question. And the thing is, the medical people that Elvis had around them, it did become difficult because they kind of crossed that line between friend and physician, right? And that becomes difficult, but they are trying to help Elvis always. And same thing with his doctor, Dr. Nick, always trying to figure out what's wrong with him. And Elvis has 3 major hospital stays, and he leaves each one with knowing that more is wrong with him, than what he went in with. And he does suffer from an autoimmune issue, which, again, they knew very little about then. He had recurrent infections all the time. So when he's canceling shows or leaving on stage early, from time to time, that was kind of dismissed as, again, prescription medication problem, but he really was ill. And some of the things he had, it was either difficult to treat at the time or unknown.
I think a lot of people, they think that he was lucky, just this guy that got up there, didn't really work, just boom, he was a star. But one thing that I thought was very interesting in your book is you talked about how, he's just the normal guy, and he was actually the sole provider for not only his immediate family, but also for his cousins and aunts and uncles, all that good stuff, right?
Absolutely. You know, Elvis is so larger than life that sometimes we don't want to think of him as a normal guy, but he certainly was, and he loved his family. And his main agenda in life was not to become the most famous man on the planet to ever live. His only agenda was to provide for his parents, particularly pull them out of poverty. And he did that. And he also did it for, like you said, aunts and uncles, cousins, all work at Graceland from time to time. His grandmother lives at Graceland. You know, I always kind of joke, if you want to know how real and normal Elvis was, his grandmother lives with him. And how many rock and roll stars, you know, take girls back to Graceland to meet grandma. So, you know, it really was. Family was so important to him. Being a provider was so important to him. And that does play a big role in his health issues too, because when he's sick and he knows he needs to stop and people are saying, Elvis, you need to take a break from touring and whatnot, he says, I can't, you know, too many people rely on me. So not only pulling them out of poverty, but then keeping them there, you know, was always a constant worry, even after he had made millions of dollars.
And I think some people, they thought he was depressed, but your book finds that he was not.
I think he dealt with the depression that would come from illness, you know, not be able to perform the way he wanted to because he had all these things wrong with him. And one of them was a major colon problem, which made performing difficult. Controlling his blood pressure was difficult before he'd go on stage, certainly after he'd come off stage. So I think all of that was very difficult for him and would lead to some depression, but not in the way, in the Howard Hughes, you know, recluse kind of way that he's always been described. And certainly at the end, towards the end, he's spending more time at Graceland. He's spending more time in his room. And I believe it was because he didn't feel well.
Your book is so detailed. It actually goes in and it talks about all these prescriptions that he was taking in between performances. What was it like as a fan and an enthusiast to gather all that information, to really talk to these people and get that kind of information?
Well, you know, meeting people who knew Elvis, whatever capacity that was, from his nurse to his pilot, you know, to friends, was just incredible for me as a lifelong fan. But then, of course, as a journalist, you want that firsthand information. So that was just priceless, too. And then, you know, learning about all the medical situations, and then as a journalist, you know, that's what we do. We have to become experts in that. So that was fun for me. And then to be able to write it in a way that Elvis fans and pop culture enthusiasts would want to read about, because this isn't a medical book, you know, it is an Elvis book, but we have to understand what was wrong with him, to understand the decisions he made, and to understand some of the lifestyle choices he made, because there is an answer there. And from a journalistic standpoint, you know, I always thought the most important question was, why did Elvis turn to prescription medication in the first place? And no one, you know, oddly had really ever asked that question, and no one had answered it before this. So that's ultimately what this book does.
And then the last thing, Elvis is not alive. He's not hiding somewhere on an island. You talk about this in your book as well, right?
Yeah, because when we talk about how, you know, pop culture and whatnot has kind of chipped away at Elvis's legacy because he is so iconic, you know, that is certainly the biggest way that it happens, right? When we're still telling stories about Elvis sightings and things like that, and we know they're not accurate, and as much as maybe some people would like them to be, you know, he did die at age 42, sadly, on August 16th, 1977.
All right, tell us, how do we find the book? Go ahead and plug everything we need to know.
ElvisAuthor.com is my website, and that's a great place to start because it does talk more about the research and the people I interviewed, and those copies will be signed. And then it's also on Amazon, of course, because that's easy for everybody. So.
All right. Once again, I mean, it was fantastic. I was sitting there getting lost. I actually forgot I was at work because I was sucked into this thing. Thank you so much for joining us, too.
Absolutely. So great speaking with you.
All right. Folks, up next, we are talking everything about Kentucky voter deadline.